native, and there's somebody in the room here that's known me since I was 10 years old. And Mrs. Clayton has been fabulous in my life. I was in 4-H, that's where I got into public speaking years back, and she used to make that trek from here to Dade City every time we had some kind of county event, and I've always had a fondness for her and her husband also, so good to see you. And thank you all for coming out on a day like today, a beautiful day, one of the few we've had lately, even though we do need rain. But this is a picture of my mother and I. My work in terms of writing and all the background came from her. She had an early interest in history and was collecting things before it was fashionable. She did over 200 taped interviews on the most primitive of taping equipment. And the only reason that I ever found out about it was when I moved back home. I taught in Texas and in Ohio before I got back to USF. I was at her house one day and I saw a box of stuff and I said, "Mama, what is that?" "Oh, I've been taping old people's interviews, old crackers interviews." And I said, "You're just going to let them sit there?" "Well, I don't know what to do with them." So that started all of it. And it's been, if I get teary-eyed, my mom just passed away a few years ago. I still, when I give presentations like this, I just am amazed that this person did all this stuff, and now, of course, it's commonplace to do the kind of histories that we do. So this was my mom and I, it's Elizabeth. This is our new book that just came out last year. It's called Going, Almost Gone, and it's Lutz-Land and Lakes Pioneers Share Their Precious Memories. And the first one we did was the Citrus Sawmills book, which you have. This was based upon, to give you an idea of how we went about doing this, Mama wrote a weekly column for the St. Petersburg Times. A young reporter got her into it. I wrote them. She told me about them. I didn't know. It was one of the greatest things. My dad and she and I would sit there and she'd tell me things. And my father was very colorful. He could fill in some of the blanks, you know, of people. But this was more of a straight-out history. The one that we did this time came about because of all those tapes. And this book has first-person accounts of people about just about everything beginning around 1910s and going through, the book pretty much goes through up to the present as much as we could. And the photograph there you will of course be extremely knowledgeable of because you have Dupree Gardens in the background, which we all know about, and then my family, my grandfather who was the immigrant on the left, that's my mom's family. And then we were in the citrus business and still are, and of course fruit stands were a big thing, so along US 41, more towards the Lutz area was the Goheen family that went to our church, and so that was the progression of the fruit stand and kind of went the way of most of them. So that's a little bit about how we got into it. The uniqueness of the book then is the taped first-hand accounts in there, and also we actually are the first local history to our knowledge in Florida to trace commerce through the emergence of commerce in a community. And secondly, to include detailed maps and where we would put where these things were located, so that if you were going down US 41 through Land O'Lakes all the way up through Cowler's Corner, you would actually see where all of these places were, and some of them still have parts of them left. So it was also the case that we used a lot of local documents. Fortunately, the Land O'Lakes Civic Association had a little weekly that they call the local, actually monthly. And my mother and my aunt, between the two of them, saved them all. And that's how we got a lot of them, because there's no one else that has them. And so we thought, well, it would be interesting for people, publications that aren't available, just to take some things out of the book as well, out of these publications. So it was a combination of all of those things. This is my grandpa, the one who was an immigrant. He came here from Germany in 1911. He was the first permanent settler of Lutz, but Lutz and Land O'Lakes, he lived in Land O'Lakes. It's a long story, but the two communities are merged. He actually left and offered to be in the Frankfurt Symphony, to come over to America. It's a true immigrant story, and that was the first house. This is the one I live in today, but it looks nothing like that, of course. It's been expanded over the years, but that was my uncle and a little boy barefooted. I still like to go barefooted, by the way. And I'm a country girl. And if you have any questions, I teach for a living. I don't mind you raising your hands and so forth. And that was my mom's family. She was the one on the far right. This is my great-grandmother, Annie Perry Sisk, another old family. Annie Sisk Perry in the Land O'Lakes area. And that was her first home over here on the right in a local lake in Land O'Lakes. And she was a dear person. Well, everyone's grandmothers, I think, are dear, but my great-grandma especially. She liked to fish, and so do I. So this thing called Land O'Lakes, if you go to Land O'Lakes and you talk to a bunch of old-timers, everybody will swear that they were the one that gave a name to Land O'Lakes. And they were probably right, because the official name was adopted at a Lutz-Land Civic Association meeting. And of course, I did actually run into a lady. They gave a $25 check to people who had the winning name, and a lady contacted me probably 20 years ago and told me that she got the $25 and how they named it. And some people say it's from the Land O'Lakes, the butter kind of thing. But it just came to be, and it really encompasses all these little places. The two largest areas in today's Land O'Lakes, well, actually the four would be Myrtle, Denham, Drexel, and Erin. And the others a little bit more towards the north. But the bottom picture is the Lake Paget Estates, if any of you are familiar with that. It was what life was like in the 50s when we first started to look at the, have photographs. And it was mostly, as you see here, lakes and citrus in a few places. The lady in the picture at the top, some of you may know her and her husband, Walter Franzel and Betty Franzel. She's still living, and she raises dogs. But her husband and she really pushed the state road department to finally put Land O'Lakes on the map. So we attribute a lot of the effort, because let's face it, bureaucracies in Tallahassee were just as bad then as they are now. So, you know, getting something through sometimes can be a bit difficult. Just to show you the heritage, the massive spearhead on the left was found at the corner of Livingston and State Road 54, which is near where I live. And this lady gave it to my mom years ago, and it was just, always as kids, we just couldn't wait to find something like that. We never did, but I found plenty of arrowheads over the years. The top picture is of some of the first settlers in the area, and you see that their transportation was straight out a horse and buggy, and sometimes oxen and wagons. The gentleman on the bottom, some of the Asbel family, if you're familiar with some of the families in Land O'Lakes, they gave us some fabulous pictures, but as you know, citrus was second and lumber was first in the area. Of course, we, like you, have some great train depots. This was actually a work train that was parked at the corner of 54 and 41, Land O'Lakes. And it was a torn photo, but kind of a really priceless one that, and of course you see all the time period, the utility poles. And I had to drive through North Florida recently on business, and I saw some of these old poles I couldn't believe were still alive when we have hurricanes in Florida, but so be it. And of course, again, lumber and sawmills was one of the first industries, which is why the name of our first book, Citrus, Sawmills, Critters, and Crackers, comes from the progression of the industry there. Those were heavy pieces of lumber, by the way, and took 2 or 3 guys to lift them up into the. And wouldn't it be interesting, how many times today would you go by and see a foreman with a suit and hat on? Kind of a change there as well. Again, watermelons in the 50s. We had a big watermelon field next to where we lived, and of course it was just commonplace, but it was the refrigerated cars, as you know, on the trains that made a lot of the produce shippable to other parts of the country. That's where I got my first introduction to people busting watermelons in a field and eating the heart out of them, if you ever did that. So you didn't get the seeds. They didn't have seedless ones then. But it was nothing better. To this day, I can't take a lot of the watermelons. They just don't quite taste the same. Major roads weren't major, but they were what was there. This was actually on our property and the area around where we lived, just a sandy dirt road. Right now, if you live on a sandy road like I did, it's a mud bowl. You can hardly move. So they went through all of that, droughts, and were in deep ruts and so forth when cars first came in. But that was actually just how you got around. So we've come a long ways, needless to say. And early on, Lake Patience Road is the intersection of Lake Patience and 54 in downtown Land O'Lakes, okay? It was a major road, and of course the county contracted with private contractors to do the road. So this is all the families that lived along Lake Patience and how much they were going to cost to pave that particular area. And then the company that did it, it's a very, very prominent name in Tampa and Land O'Lakes, Pasco County, J.W. Connor and Sons Paving. And of course the Connors lived in Land O'Lakes, and so it was only natural that they would get the contracts, and they did. And family that's continued to give a lot back to Pasco County in its history. But that's J.W. Connor and some of his crew explaining what was going on. But this is an example of where we would mesh documents with a lot of things that we put in the book. It's kind of, some people might refer to it as a kind of a local scrapbook, where you put together a sundry of things. There were 2 or 3 primary intersections, and of course for years US 41 was State Road 5. And so this map came from my uncle. It's circled there, and you see the 5 on the left. I don't have a pointer, but you can get a gist of it. So it went all the way through. The intersection on the bottom is US 41 and State Road 54.
That is the heart of Land O'Lakes.
This is, I live on the other side of 54 towards Dade City, but you know, this is what I remember as a kid. And of course the store on the bottom right was gas station, anything you could pretty much get there. And not a car in sight. The one at the top is Gower's Corner, which is US 41 and State Road 52, which is never looked like that anymore. But at one time, the same person owned all 4 corners, and it actually was Gower's Corners. You probably are familiar with that, but that's what that looked like. And the Chapman family that I went to school with is who ran the station there for a long while. So things have really changed a lot in terms of transportation. This is one of my favorite pictures that we got for the book. This is the famous Erin Pine Sawmill, which was a massive, hundreds of people employed here. And I got a call out of the blue one day. This is how all this kind of works, as you know, from this wonderful place that you have. A gentleman said, are you the one that writes these history books? And I said, no, it's really my mother. I help her write them, but you know. He says, I got a picture of the Erin Sawmill because some relative used to work there, and this is how we got this picture. But on the far left, and the sawmill was owned and operated by, again, another German immigrant, Mr. Mueller. And he came in with the Moss. Some of you remember Moss Brothers. There were 3 or 4 major entrepreneurs coming from Germany. My grandfather wasn't part of that. He came to New York and was actually a miller by trade and was ready to go back. He tried his luck out in the Midwest and was back in New York City, ready to get on a plane to go back to Germany, and not plane, and saw that the advertisement, come to Florida, grow oranges, and the rest is history. So I have the advertisement. But on the far left was the dwelling of the Muellers. And as you see, the massive porch all around the home, and the little, I wish I had a ruler here, but I don't. Okay. The second place over People ask why I have to stand when I give presentations because I'm so short. The second one over towards the front here was the depot. And so you see that. The one here in the front was the larger one, the commissary. The mill headquarters and office was here. The little building in the front up here was the world's smallest post office. It literally was in Ripley's, believe it or not, as, you know, and we have another shot of it in a different location. But to give you an idea, that the road-looking structure, which was railroad, became Erin Cutoff. So those of you who know that area. Far, far in the back was the Methodist Church. I guess I'm a Methodist, so I think that's a good thing. And the rest of these were different kinds of dwellings. But it was an incredible operation. My cousin, who loves metal detecting, and of course knew the area, found these babbitts, which were the coins that you used at the commissary. And it was really interesting because, and the same guy, Mueller, owned both of these sawmills. The round one, if you can see imprinted, it says Gulf Cypress Lumber Company, Erin, and it says F.E. Mueller, proprietor here. The other ones, the scalloped ones, are the ones from the actual Erin sawmill. But he found a whole bunch of those just digging around up there. And so we have those. Again, this is some of the Asbel family photos. Just look at that lumber. And it would take, the sawmills, the cypress that they were getting out of there was so huge, it would take multiple men to fell it and then cut it and load it. But they looked like they'd had a long day there. Yes, thank you. I need one of these in my class today. Thank you. Excellent. So anyway, that's just a huge piece of lumber back there, cypress. Then of course, things got a little bit better with tractors. I have to tell you a little bit of a story. I am a country girl, as you know, and a few years ago, I don't teach in the summers at USF, and one of my colleagues asked me when I got back, you know, for the fall, if I'd gone on any nice vacation that summer. And I looked at him and said, no, I went to the Kubota tractor dealer. This guy looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I had explained to him, you know, he didn't have any idea our family had. I said, I had to buy a tractor. I didn't go anywhere. So, but I've always had an affinity with tractors over the years. So look at this hatchet here and these guys pulling out something. And believe me, that was a wonderful invention, the tractor. Going back to the Erin sawmills, this is what it looks like now, just a big pasture. But one of the absolute joys was my mother was able to interview two African-American sisters, from Marshall sisters. Some of you may know the Marshall family, very prominent black family in Land O'Lakes. Helen and Florine. And they grew up on the sawmill, and their dad worked there, and he was also a minister on the side. So he would, and a kind of a traveling minister, going from various churches to another. But they had wonderful stories. One of the sad ones was that their dad was actually killed in an accident working on the paving of State Road 5. But they had wonderful stories. They also said something that was intriguing to us. We had no knowledge. There were a large number of African Americans who worked at the mill, but there were two different kinds of homestead situations. Some of the African Americans who worked there actually owned their own dwelling. Others, the sawmill provided housing for. These two young ladies actually lived in a home that was owned by their family, which was very unusual. But these are the kind of things that I'm so grateful my mother captured, that had she not just taken this kind of interest, which I know all of you understand history is the preservation. And of course, turpentine, those of you who know much about that, that's a cat face, and that's actually embedded. A developer gave this to us. He found this tree with it still embedded in it, and he gave the photo to my mom, but this is actually a turpentine tree in Pasco County. Of course, citrus came after timber. Smudge pots, those were all in my backyard at once. I have none of them now because it's EPA unlawful. But I did have them. And for those of you who don't know what they are, they used to put fuel in those and kerosene and heat them, and smoke would come and try to get the air circulating when it was freezing. I just love it when people up north think that it never gets below freezing in Florida, because my family has lost a lot of citrus over the years when we have major freezes. And so this is just an example here. Probably one of the best known in all of Pasco County citrus roadside stands was Joe Sweeney's Hobby Grove. And this was what it looked like in its heyday. So it had a little, area over here, greenhouse type thing. It sold fresh fruit in the front on these little boxes out front, and inside you could get orange juice and whatever else you wanted, all kinds of, I'd say, tourist trap kinds of things, but that's not a proper term to use probably. But what I also love, they would send out these cards every year. This was in the 90s. Joe Sweeney's Hobby Grove, Lutz, Florida, but it was actually Land O'Lakes. And, but here, isn't it interesting? It was sent to someone who lives in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan, so I found this particularly interesting. And they would send these people who would be repeat customers every winter. They'd come down, and on the way back to Michigan or wherever, they'd stop and buy a whole bunch of fruit. And you get their address and send them something off. But this is again an example of where you have like documents and stuff that are so interesting that I think some people, when you do history, you tend to think only photographs or whatever, but the documents plus the maps and everything, I think it makes it a bigger story. Somebody have a question?
I noticed the postcard is a penny.
Yeah, exactly.
And a postcard.
A penny, right. And now it's going up to 49 cents. Remember what they said about the good old days? Citrus in our area, this was the Clark Fruit Company. It was the biggest area where growers, they would buy people's fruit. They bought ours for years. It was a Jacksonville-based company, but their largest presence in Central Florida was in the Land O'Lakes area. And they employed a lot of people, and some of our best stories came from people that worked with these tales of discovering snakes and all kinds of animals and whatever, or visits to nudist colonies on business, of course, and things like that. But, we'll come back to it. But it later turned into a co-op. When the big freezes in the 80s and whatever chased a lot of people out of business, and it turned to a cooperative called Blue Key. My dad was one of the board of trustees members, and then the citrus industry, so many people sold out to development. And unfortunately, we have greening of our trees at the moment, so we have to make a decision real soon as to whether to push out an industry that's been in our family 100 years or start over. And my sister and I are fighting about it, but I think I'm older, so I'm going to win. I'm going to keep it. So this was on our property here, firing. If you didn't use the smudge pots, people would just put wood in the groves, anything to keep the air circulating, to keep the frost from staying on the freeze too long. Basically, if it gets in the mid to 28 degrees or lower, you run into problems, especially if it sits there a long time. And you don't really, at the point when you have a bad freeze, care about the fruit loss. You care about the tree loss. The other thing that surprises me always, how many of you are Yankees or will admit to it? A couple, okay. We would have relatives come down from Michigan and they see all this fruit on the ground and, oh, let's pick it up. I said, don't eat that, But they thought that was just perfectly okay to eat. I would never eat an orange that had fallen to the ground. But they didn't have any problem with it. And of course, again, the tractors and how they've progressed over time. I grew up learning how to drive practically on a tractor. Yes?
I just have a little side note about Clark's Fruit Company.
Okay.
My uncle, Harold Hunter, married Maxine Pierce. They went to Gulf High School together, and he was vice president of Clark Fruit Company in Jacksonville.
That's awesome.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, it is. Well, they certainly were vital to our family's economics.
And they both went to Gulf High School together.
Yeah. Of course, these great citrus labels, I love them. If you go to Tallahassee to the Florida History Museum, they've got just tons of them. But we have our very own. Denham was where it was, but at the time, they'd still use the Lutz post office. But Denham was right around the intersection of State Road 54 and Lake Patience Road. Cummings Packing House was very big, and it later turned into Warren's Fruit Company, when you could see the magnitude of it, the size of it. It was a packing house, and then he took it over as both packing house and fruit company. And of course, nothing but the finest citrus fruit. Here, now we're starting to see the Land O'Lakes address, and he still lives in the oldest home in the area. This is Harold Warren, and he's very active in the Lutz-Land O'Lake Pioneer thing that we have. We've heard of the name Todd Woods, another big citrus grower in our area. His daughter loves horses. So when they had the freeze in the 80s, he sold out and actually pushed out and gave his property to his daughter. So for a long time, this is at the intersection of 54 and 41, of Collier Parkway and 54, which is towards Dade City. It was a place where she for years trained race horses, and I would go to horse gatherings when I was in Texas or whatever, teaching. I taught there for a while. I would see her stuff and her horses. But then when they widened the road, she sold, and she still has the stables. Judd Stables is what it was called. But all that you'll see resemblant or reflective of that time period, if you're in Land O'Lakes and you go by the shopping plaza at the corner of 54 and Collier Parkway, the topiary is what's there, and that was part of the negotiation when she sold the property to them. She says, I want some reflection of horses. Never mind that her dad made all the money from oranges, but that's another story. You can see here what I'm doing is I'm going through different commerce, and this is one of the things that has got a lot of historians' attention about our book, is that we were actually able to do this, to track something from its inception and to see how commerce developed. I love economics, so that's kind of why we got into it. But you'll see this was Land O'Lakes Lumber and Building Supplies. The only picture that we have of it, it's at the corner. This was Erin Cutoff in 41. And the only picture that we have, anybody has, which is ironic because it was a huge entity, was looking through the fence at a ball field over towards the building supplies. But it is no longer either. Hardware stores. There's some absolute wonderful history on this one. The top left up there, and these two were the first hardware store in Land O'Lakes, right at Erie Cutoff, the community center over there. And it was owned by a gentleman called Worth Johnson. He sold out to the Harveys, Ted Harvey and Emma Lou Harvey. She and her son still run this. This is what it looks like if you're driving along 41 today. Her husband was a deputy sheriff at one time, but now she is, she says she's retired, but every time I go into the store I see her. So I think it's wonderful. And so her son and she run it, and they sell our book. And there are, if you're a cracker and you grew up in Land O'Lakes and you come home, you've been out of town, living somewhere, you're going to stop in there because it's just that place where they know where everybody is. The other day I had to try to track down somebody, so I called Mrs. Harvey. I said, where is such and such? Oh, well, honey, he's such and such. So, but it's really fabulous that they, so people know to go there, locals that want to purchase the book, and they have one out there for people to look at. And I have to say, in my years as a youngster in school, Mrs. Harvey was the best substitute teacher we ever had. And I always tell her that when I go in there. But it's funny how you remember things like that. Grocery stores. This was the O.D. Woodward grocery store at the corner of 54. Remember the intersection I showed you with the intersection of 54 and 41? That was just a grocery. This is what it looked like first. It was owned by the Woodwards. You could kind of see the shape of it. A little bit of everything. Remember these kind of gas pumps and so forth. And this was what their place looked like with the palm trees and so forth. But I grew up with their granddaughter. She was my closest friend and still is in terms of locals. This is the first big grocery store I say grocery store, big one. This was Wells Grocery at the corner of Erie Cutoff and 41. And Selma Wells and her husband actually had purchased the property from the Snyder family, but they also were, you can't see it too clearly here, but this was also the bus depot. So you could get a bus to get out of Land O'Lakes if you needed to. And then over time, they expanded their grocery, and they ended up having at the other end of the store here little things, little knick-knack places that kind of came and went over time. South Riding, if you go to Land O'Lakes today and you see a place called Hungry Harry's, which has delicious barbecue, that's what the old South Riding grocery, that's what that was. Mr. Sockley's, who's the gentleman up in the right-hand corner, really was a great lover of history and always gave a lot of good things to my mom. And of course it says just north, and of course you can see how important Sweeney's was because he used it as a moniker or a director just north of Sweeney's Hobby Grove because everybody knew where that was. The oldest still standing and abandoned grocery around the area of Erie Cutoff towards the Sawmill was this place over here. And a friend of mine, when I started working on the book, she and I grew up together, and we decided we're going to stop and go into this place. And I know people thought we were pilfering or whatever, but it was amazing because the construction on it is so good.
Oh, nice.
And just fantastic. And they're still arguing about what to do with it. And of course we have a historical plaque for the Erie community which gives the history of the sawmill and so forth. Of course, filling stations were huge. This was, the Muellers were diverse in their economic interests. They also had a gas station out on 41. And this was the daughter of the Mueller. And those cars parked out there. I love to have a Tampa cigar sign. And this drink I'm not familiar with, but of course Coca-Cola I am. That gives you an idea. Another local gas station at the corner of Lake Patience Road and 41. Turned over quite a bit. May 21st, 1946. And it talks about the way you can see the old car and the pure and so forth. Some of the legacies on the top left was an old station that turned into a bar that now, the other day when I walked, it was abandoned for a long while. When I was driving up towards Land O'Lakes, it's now a jail bond place. So, a little bit of transition economically on that. The major gas station at the corner of Lake Patience at 41 was this one, the Land O'Lakes service station. Peggy Reed and her husband Dick owned this piece of property. Turned over 3 or 4 times. It's a landmark. If you were a kid, I lived south of this towards Tampa. I was more towards the intersection of 54 and 41, but all the kids I went to school with in Land O'Lakes, most of them lived near this area. And also at the time, the Snyders owned the piece of property that ultimately became Wells Grocery. So they had a tourist court, and they had a garage. They sold this to the Wellses to make a grocery store. This was when they were building their garage. But a really interesting thing, they had 7 or 8 tourist cabins in the back. They also had a lot of kids. And we have a great story of a neighbor of theirs that said that they had so many kids that they had to use the cabins for the kids, probably to get them out of the house. But when the tourists came, they all had to move back in. A little fractiousness, I guess, you know. Gower's Corner, we saw an aerial of it earlier, and the Chapman family, very nice. I went to school with their kids, and he was very, very generous with his time and gave us a lot of pictures and so forth. Yes.
What direction are we looking at?
This would be going. This would be looking north. This would be the intersection here of 52 on this one. So that would be going towards 41.
Yeah, that would be the southwest corner then.
Right, right.
Okay.
Thank you, I'm not good at directions. So. Farms, ranches, dairies. really big. I have to, every time I see one of these kinds of photos of these animals, and I guess, well, this, I don't know who this gentleman is, but looks like he had a hard day. I don't know who is looking tired of the animal or him. Famous tree, you all know about it, one of the oldest trees, the Bexley tree. And it's just massive, and of course Bud Bexley and his wife Pat, both deceased now, owned massive amounts of property, the biggest ranch area in central Pasco. The other big one was the Connor Ranch, which is still, if you drive past on Erin Cutoff, you'll see that particular thing. Now, just when you think, I love this story, this came out of the local, when people think that only cattle rustling occurs on television, look at the headlines on this was in the 50s. This is not an interpretation of a TV program, so they're talking about real life rustlers. And I actually have a better first-hand account of one of the people that ended up catching some of them when they just shot them right on the spot. And there was nothing said about it, because if you were stealing somebody's cows, you were stealing their livelihood. Another, the dairies. Yes. The dairies, the one on, these are relatively same time period. The one on the left, a Hispanic family, the Blancos. This would be as you're nearing the Veterans as it cuts, or Suncoast Parkway as it cuts across. You're coming this way from towards Land O'Lakes, their property was right near there. But they had a dairy, didn't speak a lot of English. My mother was the 4-H leader for Octavio, who is now the local vet. So he pulled himself up. His family was really deeply proud of him because they were an immigrant family, and he's now a vet. And likes to talk a lot, so fortunately doesn't charge by the hour when it comes to see me. The family on the right, again, Cleveland family, came out of Connecticut. Large family, 2 of the kids are missing. But the Cleveland family started the 4-H Dairy Club in Pasco County, and they came from Connecticut, and they had a great story too. They were moving their herd down from Connecticut, and when you think about it, they would have to call up a dairy and arrange where they could keep their cows overnight. And they had to have it all the way down the way to organize how they'd get their herd down to, from Connecticut down to Land Lakes area. Real estate, big old time Pasco County names coming up here too. Sears Realty was the biggest, the oldest one. That piece of property is still standing. I don't know what it is. It changes what it is about every hour. But Sears actually hired some women, and they themselves became realtors. So he was one of the kind of icons in the real estate business. And of course, Madeline Prince, she said, and we interviewed her, that she figured that she'd sold every piece of property to Land O'Lakes people 2 or 3 times. That they bought one, sold it, bought another, sold it, and so that ultimately she sold just about something to everybody there. Very interesting woman. Her, she had was just short of getting a PhD in economics, and never told anybody any of that, because at the time it probably would have chased off some of the old crackers. They would have thought, well, this educated woman from the East, we don't need to buy anything from her. But she was fabulous, and she could sell anything. As they say, ice to an Eskimo. She was so excellent. Her daughter ended up being a major television person, and now she's a chief lobbyist for one of your favorite firms, Exxon, Chevron, one of those big oil companies. But just a, and of course Iris Jones preceded her, T.P. Baker, all of them. Look at what they point out they're selling: groves, ranches, lakefronts, motels, farms, groves, ranches, lakefronts, motels. And then you get a little bit of an expansion here, but real estate still big. And of course the biggest first subdivision, some of you may know the name D. Carr Covington Jr. Anybody here? Politician. Not necessarily the most upright of politicians as it turned out, but he was one. And he had the wherewithal and foresight to develop this Lake Padgett Estates, which is still in existence, one of the big subdivisions. And of course you see the picture here, Bell Lake Road is marked here. and US 41 there. So, at the time they named Land O'Lakes, they estimated there were 50-some lakes there. And so anyway. The other big developer, the Connor family, this was Lakefront Estates, which, by the way, was carved out of some of the property that some of the other families had, some of the big citrus people. And also, the land was sold, Dupree Gardens, I'm sorry, was where it came out of. Some of that property, and it's a little touchy subject with the Connor family, some of it ended up ultimately becoming a nudist colony, and their family is very not into that. But it is what it is, and it was one of those things. Banking finally came to Pasco, to Central Pasco in the 60s. People's Bank of Land O'Lakes. And of course that was, you know, it had to have Mickey Mouse and whatever, 70s Mickey Mouse and whatever come in. And these are the only pictures that we have of this, actually. And it's because this woman gave us the photos. She found out we were doing the history of the area and offered up her photos. And of course Florida was, you know, Land O'Lakes, besides the bank and whatever. You all know the name W.C. Law and then Curtis Law. They're longtime elected officials from our area. And he was mayor. There is no city, keep in mind. It's honorary mayor. But at one time, it was such a big event that it made the local paper, which was that all the rural postmasters of the area met in Land O'Lakes. And so that's what you see up there in the top left-hand portion, view of the crowd at the dinner. Bottom was just when they were making the bank and so forth. And I see that you've got, this caught my eye immediately, but Mr. Ruzicka, another immigrant, was the guy you went to if you want anything built in Land O'Lakes. And so ultimately, he actually built the barn that my grandmother had. But his tools were on display at the, for a while, the lumber company in Cox Lumber before it went out of business. I don't know who got the tools. This is one of my favorite stories up here. How many of you like dogs? These dogs were owned a very, very well-known lady, Alva Kearns, Haas Kearns, her parents. She had these dogs, and everybody in town knew them because she would talk about them incessantly. And she was often a person who would contribute stories to the Land O'Lakes Local, the little thing I was telling you about, publication. But my favorite story as a child, my mother, you know, we knew this. She ended up tossing her husband out pretty much, okay? They had a divorce. And when they were repaving US 41 and widening it, she tossed her wedding ring into the cement and just let it go. She said she's done with him, so. You gotta have a little fun with history, don't you? I mean, you really do, so. It's one of those stories that sticks with you as a kid, and it stuck with me.
It's the part of US 41 that's been dug up, right?
Yes. Yeah. But she was very much a character, and you know, just helped save a lot of the history. Of course, the Sunshine Social Circle made those quilts up in the top left. My sister still has them because my grandmother was part of that circle. And another old Pasco County family, the Hunt family, which has a big reunion every year. Tabby Hunt and her husband Ed. These are artifacts from their home. Her name, we called her Tabby, and for years I thought it was because she was named after a cat. But it was only when I was working on this book that I found out her name was Tabitha. It wasn't Tabby for the cat. It was actually her, just a short for her name. But I guess it made a better story as a child. I think it was the cat. And of course the Dennison family, another one, homemade clothes. I see these two gentlemen pretty often around town, and they were really very, very happy when we found this picture to put in the book. They like it. So. Restaurants and bars, every place has them. Trucker's Haven, one of those old-time stopping places because truckers would stop there, but it had one of the best restaurants in Land O'Lakes. It is no more, but it was for years. And so, and then you also had another place called Mom's Good Eats. And look at what you could get here. Plate lunch, it's closed Sunday, of course. Steaks and chops, sandwiches, fried chicken, homemade biscuits, cornbread, pies, cakes, such and such. Every town has its bar. This was the Florida bar. And Nancy Bortlock is the young lady here. She was a teacher. She's retired now. Her parents owned the bar. And in interviewing her, she had a picture of the soda stool that was in the Land O'Lakes sundries. So she still has it, and even though it's a worn and everything, so she gave us that. But there's a hysterical story about this one. She said that when they opened it up, and you know, it was called the Florida Bar, you see the sign up there, people would call and want to know if that's where they could get their law license, or if that was a law license. Seriously. So, it was just a real funny story there. And of course, this was actually, you know, everybody uses buildings pass from one use to another. This was actually the old VFW hall, which was where, you know, a lot of civic events were held until they purchased it. And so anyway, that was what happened. Here's that Ripley's, believe it or not, post office. And this was again at the Sawmill. You kind of get a feel for it. Remember, we saw the picture of what, but that was the one that made it to Ripley's, believe it or not. Interestingly, the Douglas family is also another long-lived family in the Land O'Lakes area, and the old postmasters, Mr. and Mrs. Douglas, they keep trading back and forth. And one of the people we interviewed said it was because one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and they wanted to keep the job, the postmaster, so whoever was president, they would be able to. But then I know what their granddaughter, she said, no, that was just one of those stories that got around, but it was a good one, so that's how. Just to show you, and this was the Douglases with their 50th anniversary. But you'll see here that one of the return addresses on the far left was from Erin, Florida. Does everybody see that? It's a little smudged on the return address. But it was going to the paper man in Lutz. And this was 19 teens, whatever this was, 3 cents, so whoever's looking at stamp prices. And this postcard, it's a little hard to see, to the Redbrook family, which was another very old family. Myrtle, Florida, which would be as you leave on 54, go towards Dade City, it would be that area. And it says here, well, it's addressed to Myrtle, Florida. And of course, post office moved from the little one you saw to this one, and kept going. This one ended up in Land O'Lakes Plaza. Mr. Clements was the postmaster by that time, and this is the current one that you see. Mr. Roach built this Land O'Lakes Plaza. The post office got too small and dilapidated, so they had to move here temporarily while they were building the other one. Look at the fire equipment. Now this wouldn't do a whole lot, honestly. We had a major fire in our area, the Crowder family, which was a big citrus family, had a 2-story mansion. We as kids thought it was Mount Vernon. It looked like it pretty much, seriously. One Thanksgiving, it burned, and we were at home, and we saw this smoke and whatever, and these poor little things came out. There, no water could reach the building, and it obviously was one of the impetus for moving to a more sophisticated fire station. This was a whole thing about, again, notes from the Civic Association meeting, which my aunt had, talking about how they just weren't going to put up with having this situation anymore. And I also have to tell you another one about the fire department. Does anybody know what the first, I'm not really focusing on nudists today, but it's a real important part of Land O'Lakes because it is the nudist capital of the world. It is, seriously. There are multiple nudist colonies. Naturist, excuse me, is a proper term these days. But every year, as a fundraiser for the fire department, they would have a chicken dinner at the Lake Como nudist colony, nudist resort. And the grandson of the people who were prominent in that facility told us, he says people would just line up in droves thinking they were going to see, in his words, naked people, and all they got was fried chicken. But they raised a lot of money for it. So now we move to schools. we're starting to grow now, and these two schools were Myrtle and Drexel, Denham and Drexel, sorry, were in separate locations, but they were moving everything towards center Land O'Lakes, and so they moved these wooden schoolhouses, if you can imagine, over to US 41. The Godwin family got some land in exchange for this, and so that was some of the early school structures. One of the first schools was on Gooseneck Lake. My grandfather, Myrtle School, gave the property for the family because he had enough kids. He had 5 kids. They had to walk to school, but then again, it was just around the lake. So when my mother would tell me I had to walk to school, and I said, yeah, how far, you know? But anyway, one of my favorite stories there was there were no outhouses or whatever. You just had a log that laid out and you kind of sat on it or whatever. Now, it sounds primitive. So the story was that one boy was bullying a lot of other people. So one day somebody just pushed him off the log into whatever. And that was the highlight of people who went to school at that school during that time period. Everyone we interviewed, same story. So, it must have been monumental, I don't know. We also had, of course, 2 schools at Erin, one for white children and one for black children. And you see here, this was the Myrtle School I was talking about with the log out back. And so this was from the registry of the African American School, which actually was started in 1901. But you'll see from this one was the 1930-31 school year. Very, very prominent names of blacks in the Land O'Lakes area, the Marshalls, the Dawkins, Bowens, many of these ministers, as you might have, leaders in the community, and the Smiths and Phillips. And this was from an old record, which we had to go to the Pasco County School District to get these, but we thought it was an important story. We don't have any photos of it, at least we weren't able to uncover it. Sanders Memorial, named after the county judge who had been a teacher himself. It's just torn down recently. And it was what educated all my age group. I went to this same school from grades 1 to 9. And then I had to go to Dade City to school. So now there's a Land O'Lakes High. But named after this gentleman here. Off a school road right behind the community center if you're heading out on 41. First school, first class, 1949. Actually started school year 48. First graduating class, and then you see this is 7th grade before they had 8th and 9th. The Corbett's, another prominent family. My age group, everybody will identify her as their favorite teacher. It was kind of interesting, wonderful lady. Look at this school bus, can you imagine? A kid. Young people would pay an older kid to drive the school bus. Now can you imagine that today, what kind of lawsuits you might have, etc.? But I can't imagine piling that many kids into this one little vehicle here, but that was how it went at the time. Another terrific photo here. This was my school bus driver, and her daughter gave us this photo. Notice at the top it says, "My mom, school bus driver, Mary Wilson Thomas." She let us have that to take a picture of. Mrs. Wilson won some kind of radio contest, and what she got was a supply of Coca-Colas for umpteen years. So she pulled into a little gas station and paid for all of us, with her winnings, to have a Coca-Cola that day. And here I am right here. So anyway, it's very touching. This was in would have been the 50s. Early churches, Erin African American community had 2. The AME Church and the Oak Grove Baptist Church. Preachers sometimes went between the 2. We have many, many stories. The Marshall sisters talked a lot about that church and their dad's ministry. And what was also interesting is the white families that lived around there figured out early on that these churches had far better music than their own. So they would actually, young people, Mrs. Kersey, some of you may know her, she was a terrific source of information, and she talked about the days when she was 8 or 9 years old that she'd just sit outside the churches and listen to the music. And so it's kind of and finally, a couple years ago, the county did put up this nice historical marker for the area. First kind of Baptist church was Drexel Baptist, which is now Land O'Lakes. This is the old original ledger from their church membership. My cousin is a minister there right now. We're split. We're Methodist and Baptist, so we have a little bit of a. But anyway, you can see that it was the ledger itself was just fascinating. Douglas's, all the oldest names, Snyder's, Tucker's, and so forth. Here, Jones. But another very, very prominent church in Land O'Lakes, the Church of God. A lot of members here. The first one. This building actually is still standing. If you were on Erin Cutoff Road, it's right as you come off of 41 onto Erin Cutoff. And some of the earliest church members, and they always every year at Easter had a church photo out front. Meeting places, the VFW Hall. The Civic Center started meeting here. Many churches got their start here. We had our high school dance or junior high dances at this particular place, which became the Florida Bar that I showed you a little bit earlier. This just is the genesis of the Land O'Lakes Civic Association, and where it was meeting, you see the VFW Hall on Highway 41. They're going to have some kind of entertainment and refreshment afterwards. I don't know what it ever was, but it must have been fun. Then you had the beginning of raising money to build a civic center and box lunches. I have to read this to you because it's really funny, the box lunch. Today, if you got this, you would be accused of being politically incorrect by far. But anyway, it says here an old-fashioned box social will be held at the YMCA camp, which is what this place is, on Sunday, July 14, 5 p.m. Adult and junior boxes will be auctioned off separately, with the male winner of each bid becoming the supper partner of the person preparing the box. So obviously men never prepared the boxes, and they just got to, whatever. So anyway, my times have changed, as we say. Land O'Lakes Community Center came in the 60s. We have the All Heroes Memorial that was also placed at the same site. So we're coming up to more modern times. Barber shops. There was one here in the old community center, and there was one in Land O'Lakes downtown. That's what that place looks like right now. But ladies, you'll understand this, that everybody said if you wanted to know gossip, you went to the barber shop. So, this is the picture of Lake Como, which is considered to be one of the oldest naturist locations, and it was the beginning of that industry in Central Pasco. Now we have a lot more. But this was what it looked like. This was where they had those chicken dinners, and people thought they were going to see something, but they didn't. Another favorite story of mine, I'm serious. I interviewed this lady. She was in her 80s when she told me this story. She said she and a girlfriend, when the first place first opened, which was, I think, 40s, late 40s. Her and her girlfriend went to the area and were laying on the ground trying to peek into the property, and their mother came along. She said she got the worst whipping that she got in her life. Now you couldn't do that either, but and she said, we just kept trying to see something. We didn't see anything. Times don't change sometimes. One of the oldest motels in downtown. This building's still standing too. It used to be the Drexel Motel. This actually is still operative. It's not a motor court anymore. It's just apartments, but it's the oldest still standing place of commerce in Land O'Lakes. These are just some of these other kinds of places that kind of came and went. This was the granddaddy of all, the Lake Paget gift shop, and a little bit of everything. It turned into when the roadside stands kind of started disappearing, it tried to turn local. It became Ivy's and sell things for farmers and whatever, but pretty soon it just wasn't enough to sustain the business that it was getting, and so it went out of business. Pieces of this are still there. If you were to drive down 41, there's a place called, I think it's Lake Paget Mobile Home. Right in front of that is a long building cut in half, and the half of it would have been part of that. Here's some of the early brochures from Dupree Garden. You've probably seen a lot of this. This was one of the brochures. And by the way, a lot of these women in here were local Pasco County residents that they were able to get employed. The law girls, a lot of them worked at the Dupree Gardens. See the interior here, Native American rugs, fireplace, a nice dining area. Here's the menu. Swiss cheese sandwich for 25 cents. Dessert, devil's food cake, 15 cents. And so forth. Not exactly pricey, I guess. But this showed how popular it was when it first opened. But it just didn't last long because World War II broke out and they couldn't really attract people. But the woman whose family, one of the relatives of the Dupree, the gentleman who started this, gave us, Mary Conover gave us a whole book on this place to be able to get photos from.
It's gone now?
It is, it is. It didn't last very long at all. In fact, all you see now is this,
That's right.
the old ticket booth right there. Now it's become a subdivision, Dupree Lakes.
Yeah.
This was the lodge. That's still part of the area that somebody lives in. Another great story. Herbert Dupree Carrington was Mr. Dupree's butler and whatever for years, and had great stories to tell. There was music playing in the gardens and all kinds of things going on. But my touching one, I love flowers, and he said that he loved you know, the hollyhock kind of thing, and that he would pick them and whatever. And then they asked him if he ever went swimming in the lake, because there's plenty of gators in there. And he said, yeah, he did it at night. And he said, just laughed. He says, but the Lord was with me. I didn't get eaten, so. But what is fascinating also is that when the Dupree disappeared, he became the maitre d' for the Tampa Yacht Club and served until his death. He died at 107 years old.
There was an article in
Yes,
the
there was.
Tribune
That's
not
right.
too many years
Right.
ago about
A very, very nice man. But again, my mother, getting all these kinds of people, she just had a sense of a wide variety of people to interview, which has made it all. And of course, cemeteries. This is my grandfather and grandmother. This is a county line cemetery. You can't get in there unless you have a linkage to 10 original families that were in the area around the intersection of Livingston and 41. So my grandparents are buried there. As are others. And over here we have a Confederate, a soldier. I mean, this of course is one of the plates that they found when they redid Mount Carmel Cemetery from African American. You can see he died very young, a child. This was the dedication ceremony for the Mount Carmel Cemetery. And the McKendry family would be in the graveyard at the Land O'Lakes Baptist Church. This is, I think, the Loyce. They have a cleanup every year. My mom visited one year. And, of course, I think we're one of the few that has a pet cemetery, the one on the top left, which is now at the county park on Collier Parkway. And my cousin's property is adjacent to it, and they are very grateful because some people had themselves buried with their pets. So when they tried to expand everything, they could not take up by law that cemetery. So my cousin has a buffer thanks to the cemetery between her and the noisy whatever. So these are just, I'm ending here with just some terrific shots of people, very famous. The Wilskis, you know, Wilski Road, and you'll see that. That's the Wilski family. Barnes family, old-time politicians, and I love this picture of this woman. They say she was a feisty one, and I love that picture of her driving. You know, when you write a book, sometimes you do things to your friends. This is my best friend, the Woodward girl I was talking about. And I didn't tell her I put it in there until she saw it. Her children, of course, just absolutely loved it. You know, barefoot and whatever. Another very, very famous local family, Meyer, Charlie Meyer. His daughter was Louise Andrews, who was one of the first presidents of, or board of directors of the People's Bank, and but anyway, he had this dog that would actually climb up a ladder. And just when you think that we only have floods today, this was 41. I mean, excuse me, 54 in the 40s. And just a few other shots here. That's my great-grandma on her fish. I had to have that. Sanders Plays, another school bus. And that was my mom up there with pets on the driveway going down to our lake. So I'll end with that. That was my mom who was the inspiration for all of this, and I know I'm really deeply appreciative that your museum came over and so generously graciously took some of the artifacts as we were trying to share them with museums, because obviously this was one of her dreams, was to have a museum. And it didn't pan out, but my sister and I feel wonderful because she shared it with a lot of other museums. And as I always say when I end speeches, thank God I was born here and raised here and had a mom that was so forward-looking. And at the same time, I also will always remember when I would go over to their house at night. My parents lived across the lake from where I live. I lived in my grandmother's house. We'd be working on these books and photos all over the place. And my mother would come up on something, and I'd say, well, who is this? Because I wouldn't know. And she'd say, I don't know. My dad would say, let me see that. And of course, he would always he would do certain things like, they had a picture of a barber shop, which had some girly photos on the side of the wall. And he was able to step right in and just say, well, it was 25 cents for this and 10 cents for that. So he was able to enrich that because they both grew up in the area that we did. And I have to say, in looking back, I love politics, but I also love this history, and I really appreciate you spending a Saturday afternoon to listen to my stories, and thank you so much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can if I can. Not who's going to win the election out here, I don't know. Thank you.
Road, we have occasion to be there just about every week, and I'm just curious, Aaron cut off what?
Okay. Well, it was a way to get over to 52.
Is that what?
Yes. And Aaron was the name of the town that the Muellers and them came from.
Oh, so it wasn't a family?
Right.
Aaron.
Right. No.
Okay.
It was an Aaron Germany.
Just a curious name.
It is. Yeah. Well, thank you all. And if anybody's interested, yes.
Go blue.
Go Blue. Yes. I have a misguided niece that went to Ohio State, but you know, I'm Michigan. She's talking about Michigan.
Yeah.
I'm a Michigan FSU grad, but
Do you know the origin of the name of the town Lois?
I don't.
How about Nowotny?
No.
No, okay.
The Lois.
You showed a picture of a spirit point from the beginning of your life. Was that ever radiocarbon dated or anything? Do you know when that would have come from?
I don't know exactly. I just know that she found it in the 30s. It's huge.
Right.
This is a map that we like to show, showing all the old towns.
Oh, thank you. Very nice, thank you.
Just want to show people what we do here. And we use this map as part of our talk.
Well, that is good, yeah. Here's all the old towns, right. But anyway, Pasco County is a very interesting place. And again, if anybody else has any more questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. You're much too young to know this personally, but how did Lutz and Land O'Lakes make out during the Depression years?
Well, I can tell you about Land O'Lakes, particularly, and Lutz too. They sold a lot of stuff into downtown Tampa. They made out, well, two things, moonshine, seriously. In fact, I have a bottle that was found in our grove recently.
Oh, wow.
And not that I ever had a swig of it, but But anyway, people just did that, or many people, like my grandfather had to do this. He would load up his car with produce. He'd take oranges, whatever.
That's right.
Other people would take gopher turtles down to the African-American part of Tampa, but they would take cactus and a lot of the fruit down to Ybor and sell it. That's how a lot of people made a living. Moonshine and produce, absolutely.
Probably fish, people get.
Fish, yeah.
He didn't
Well, they
have-
live with that, but in terms of any kind of economic support. And it would take a day or two to go to Tampa. In fact, growing up, we didn't go to town much. But when I went there, it seemed like it'd take forever to get there. You know, it would take an hour. Well, it would take many people from Land O'Lakes. They would have to spend the night in Tampa to sell their stuff and then come back home. And when they got the train, some of them would take that, but it was still a little expensive. But others that would take it would go shopping in Tampa. And as the train went along, it only stopped in, you know, Lutz and then and whatever. If they got near their house and they had a big load, they'd just toss it out the train window and then go get it. So they wouldn't have to walk and carry it all. We're very entrepreneurial persons, all of us. So, okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.